Having a role model in life is crucial, and when it comes to willpower, let me tell you, in my case, it's my parents. Both of them possess exceptional willpower. In other words, I've learned from them the importance of order, consistency, and perseverance. How they act, if there's something to be done, that's what gets done. Do what you must do now, in this moment. Sometimes, not this now, don't do this now, and postpone the reward for later. Do you feel like doing this? Now is not the time. And when you see this in your parents, it's much easier for you as a child to follow suit. We cannot expect our children to do things that we ourselves don't do. We cannot expect our children to have great focus if they see us wasting time on our phones, if they see us taking care of ourselves, our minds, our nutrition. And your children might say, "Dad, why don't we have?" And you reply, "After dinner." These little tips, these pieces of advice, children learn them and understand that doing what you feel like is not always the right choice, that there are things that are beneficial and others that are not. It's not about restricting, controlling, or repressing, it's about managing, healthy management. Because if you don't know how to control or can't control every impulse and urge, there's also the prefrontal cortex and that impulse, focusing on what you have now and enjoying it instead of thinking about what you'll do in half an hour and that intensity and the need to do it. In the long run, you'll feel much more frustrated in life. Well, I believe there is indeed an obsession, as you rightly mentioned, with time management, the famous FOMO that is talked about so much nowadays, what's called the fear of missing out. So, I constantly check, see if something has happened globally, personally, or within the family. I dive into chats, browse news websites, with constant fear. Nowadays, in this digital world, we find ourselves in a constant state of alertness. I highly recommend turning off notifications on your screen. I should be the one in control of the device, I should be the one controlling alerts, not alerts controlling me, because something will always happen. There's always something. You've written in a chat, the chat for your kid's school, news happening all day globally, about anything, because things are always happening. In other words, screens have turned us into people who find it much harder to relax and put our minds into a sympathetic mode, a cortisol mode, a threat mode, all of which is toxic for the body. On the other hand, there's chronopathology, which is the illness of time. Pathos meaning illness, and chrono meaning time. Always doing things, never able to stop. As Maragnon said, speed, which is a virtue, begets a vice, which is haste. Sometimes that haste, without stopping at one place or another, makes it impossible for you to slow down. A person who constantly needs to be hyperactive and engage in hyperactivism, when abruptly stopped, experiences anxiety. In such cases, what's necessary is to say, "Hey, wait a moment, you can't switch from everything to nothing all at once." You have to gradually learn to descend the steps because your brain doesn't allow for that leap. Such a massive leap can suddenly trigger an anxiety attack. I've seen it in my practice on occasion. And then, on the other hand, we have perfectionism. The perfectionist, by definition, is perpetually dissatisfied. They're always restless, on high alert, because there are flaws in everything around them. This could be better, this could be done this way. My doctoral thesis, my work, my house, order, clothes, children. And in the long run, this generates a sense of life dissatisfaction because life has a significant element of imperfection. When one is very perfectionistic, this can lead to obsessive disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and understanding the impact this has on health is going to be very important. So, for that sustained state of alertness, both due to chronopathology, FOMO, the digital world, perfectionism, and the constant need to do things in this frenetic, fascinating world we find ourselves in, we have tools. Some we have already discussed during this conversation, but I'd like to emphasize others. We've talked about sports, which I think are crucial, and I would love to mention sports in nature. There are incredibly interesting studies showing that it's not the same to exercise in a city as it is to exercise in nature. These studies have even been conducted by placing people in front of massive screens with a forest, a lake, and observing what happens in their brains and how they gradually reduce cortisol levels, managing their overall well-being. Nowadays, it is known that when one exercises on the beach, in the mountains, in nature, they relax much more. There's a part of oneself that connects much better with nature and enters that parasympathetic mode much more effectively than in a gym. However, if all you have is the gym, go for it, because it's what your body needs. Furthermore, I find it fundamental to understand everything related to getting to know our body and how my body somatizes. So, since hyperventilation is the initial response to anxiety, the rapid breathing, the need to generate more oxygen in the body, those palpitations. Nowadays, we know an easy, relatively easy, way to slow down that rapid state of palpitation, that alert state. Why? Because, as we discussed earlier, when I perceive a threat, the first thing that happens is a change in the way my lungs and heart function. Suddenly, I take in much larger breaths, I have a much more interrupted and shallow breathing, but what happens is that I get more oxygen than I should, and the shift in oxygen and CO2 in my brain will lead to that blurry vision, tingling sensations, that well-known feeling of discomfort. In other words, that initial state of extreme discomfort has much to do with the disruptive exchange of oxygen and CO2 in my body. Therefore, if one learns to breathe deeply and consciously at that moment, they can generate a sense of calm within themselves. This is closely related to various muscles in my body, including the diaphragm, which is responsible for making all of this happen. When I breathe deeply, hold my breath for a few seconds, and then exhale deeply, and if I'm able to add a positive thought. I always suggest thinking about someone you love dearly or a thought of gratitude. Suddenly, after a few minutes, my body functions better. In the end, it's just a physical movement, where we work on different types of breathing, holding the breath, even though it may be difficult at first, but it becomes a habit, even for sleeping at night. To many people who struggle to rest, I suggest practicing a breathing technique before sleep, and how their bodies can enter a state of calm by shifting to the parasympathetic nervous system. I remember one time I was on a plane, and a lady behind me was extremely afraid of flying, screaming, and the person on the other side was saying, "Just breathe." And she said, "No, I'm actually breathing too much." Well, I remember going back to help this lady breathe because she had lost control and was having a panic attack on the plane. But as we gradually relaxed her, the act of deep and conscious breathing helped her to fly and endure the entire flight. Nowadays, we are familiar with the concept of mindfulness or mindfulness meditation. I think it's a very interesting technique to understand because it involves connecting with oneself and being aware of oneself, of what I feel, how I feel, and the sensations that reach my body. Sometimes people confuse it with a form of meditation because this topic is very popular these days. I believe the important thing is that each person has their own mechanisms that help them. After many years, I've met all kinds of people who connect with different mechanisms that suddenly assist them. And what we know is that people who are able to pause and connect with themselves, with a positive thought that helps them not to be their own worst enemy, to let those negative thoughts pass, it helps immensely. Whether you meditate, practice deep breathing, or do mindfulness, there are two things that will help this thrive even better, and those are two tools: acceptance and letting go. Acceptance that I cannot control everything. Or letting go, that sometimes we get anxious because it seems like we either have to handle everything in our lives or we'll break down. When we work with all these techniques, it helps us feel better. But if what happens is that I seek relaxation through control, it will only generate an even greater state of alertness. I believe that connecting the mind and body and knowing that at this point, which I think is one of the only ones we know today, where there's such a profound symbiosis, where the mind, psyche, soul, and body all come together as one, and we can do it consciously, I think it opens up a fascinating world.